Okay, let me just recap this very quickly. In 1986 or 87, when Congress and Reagan agreed on and they passed this immigration reform, which is very often referred to as amnesty, which you just heard President Reagan talking about. That legislation did not provide amnesty or any protections whatsoever to family members of people who were in this country without documentation, who were going through the process of becoming legal citizens of the United States. Did not provide them with any protection unless both mom and dad, unless they were married and both people were going through the process. Then they both were protected and their children were protected. But otherwise, children were being deported, spouses were being deported, even though one of the people in the family was going through this whole, legal process prescribed in 1986. Reagan looked at this and said, this is wrong. And Reagan issued an executive order in 1987 or 88, which provided for the spouse of the person. But that wasn't enough. It didn't provide for the children. So in 1990, George Herbert Walker Bush was president. Dan Quayle was vice president. And Congress still refused to act on this. They were so gun-shy about immigration because they got so much crap from the right wing, I don't know how else to say it, over the whole, having done immigration in the first place, that George Herbert Walker Bush issued an executive order that said the kids of these families and the spouse of the families, if it's if only one person is applying for citizenship, they are protected too. We're not going to deport. I'm not going to deport them either. We're going to selectively enforce this law. It's called prosecutorial discretion. And George Herbert Walker Bush's action on this affected roughly 1.5 million people in this country without documentation, which was at that time 40% of the undocumented immigrant population in the United States. What President Obama is talking about doing, if the leaks out of this White House are to be believed, and I think they are, is to essentially offer that same protection to roughly 5 million Americans, or excuse me, 5 million people who want to become Americans, 5 million people who are here without documentation, which is about 40% of the population of people here without documentation. And the comprehensive immigration bill, which was passed by the United States Senate with both Democrats and Republicans, and went to the House, where it will pass if John Boehner will simply allow there to be a vote on it, has fairly strong employer sanctions in it. Now, as I pointed out, Reagan's 1986 bill had employer sanctions in it too, and in fact, Reagan campaigned on that, as you heard in his debate with Walter Mondale. But Reagan, after this passed, got incredible pressure, particularly from the construction industry, which was heavily unionized at that time. One of my brothers worked in that, and he's a union roofer at the time, or a union electrician, excuse me, at the time. And you could make a good living in construction in the early 1980s. And these companies came to Reagan and said, hey, who do you hate more, unions or undocumented workers? And Reagan was like, well, actually, it probably wasn't even a conversation with Reagan. It was probably a conversation with the wise elders of the Republican Party. But the answer was obviously they hate unions more. Unions are, organized, and they support Democrats, and they raise money for elections and things. And undocumented workers are none of the above. So they stopped enforcing the employer sanctions. And those of you old enough to remember know this to be a fact. And those of you who are not old enough to remember, let me tell you what life was like before the Reagan era. Before the Reagan era, if you got a job in construction, and you could do it with a high school diploma, and you start out, nailing roof nails in or putting up, 2x4, framing houses, whatever it may be. You start at the bottom and work your way up. And, 3, 4, 5, 10 years in, the union, you go through union training programs, you become a journeyman, and you would be making what in today's dollars. I mean, back then it was $25,000, $30,000 a year. In today's dollars, that's $60,000 a year. Good, solid union jobs with good benefits. That was the construction industry in the United States from the 1930s until the 1980s. And the same is true of meatpacking. Meatpacking is incredibly dangerous work. The meatpacking unions were so prosperous, so successful, that they built a football team in Green Bay, Wisconsin. It's called the Packers. It's the Meat Packers. That union had so much money, they built a football team. And again, the Republicans looked at this and said, okay, we got a couple of industries here that are really heavily unionized, and this administration, this Republican Party, is committed to destroying unions. What's the most effective way to destroy unions? Allow the employers to hire people who are not union members and who will work for even less than minimum wage because they're scared to death of being turned over to ICE. And good luck today. Walk onto a construction site, in one of these really fast-growing areas like Las Vegas, in one of these right-to-work-for-less states. Walk onto a construction site and ask to talk to the union foreman. Ha! Good luck. Or a meat packing plant. And, of course, those are just two of, probably 100 industries that this has happened to. So, A, we need comprehensive immigration reform to bring these people, to bring folks who have come into this country without documentation, bring them into the fold. Number two, we are a nation of immigrants. Immigrants increase the diversity of our country. They increase the resilience and strength of our country. And number three, we need employer sanctions so employers can no longer exploit people's immigration status.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 866-987-THOM.
So my take on this, particularly since we have a Democratic president who likes unions, is pass the damn comprehensive immigration reform and start enforcing the employer sanctions.